Welcome back to day 2 of Civic Engagement and Civic Infrastructure to Advance Health Equity. So happy to see all of you here today. My name is Rinku Sen. I'm the Executive Director of Narrative Initiative, and we have a wonderful panel planned right now for you on the relationship between the stories we tell, the actions we take, and what we all think we're doing here together, what the big collective project is. I'm going to start by introducing our panelists, our distinguished panel. We have Adam Carr, who is Deputy Director for Community Engagement at Milwaukee Neighborhood News Service. We also have Courtney Stewart, who is Vice President for Strategic Communications at the Missouri Foundation for Health. Along with these two, we have Philip Napoli, who is the James R. Shepley Professor of Public Policy and a faculty affiliate with the DeWitt Wallace Center for Media and Democracy at Duke University's Sanford School of Public Policy. Phil will probably win the prize for the longest title. And along with those three, we have Joshua Clark, PhD, MA, who is the political participation analyst and local researcher, lead researcher for the Civic Engagement Narrative Change Project at the Othering and Belonging Institute. So we have a engaging and exciting panel planned for you. And we're going to start with a couple of lightning rounds that the panelists are going to address some key things quickly initially, and then we'll get into deeper questions, and then we'll get into your questions from the audience. So the first question for all of you is, creating narrative and even thinking about action campaigns, doing research, really all of this is creative activity that we do. So tell us what one of your creative practices or tools is. I have a giant whiteboard in my study at home. It takes up a lot of space, but I could not do my work without it. So that's me getting us started. Adam, how about you?
Yeah, I live in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I'm in a 100-year-old house in a 100-year-old neighborhood, a beautiful, brutal, complex city. And I found when I Google image search Milwaukee, I kind of get the Christmas card version of the city. And having worked in media most of my professional life, I found it just didn't have any fidelity to the lived experience of Milwaukee for most of its people, those kinds of surface level images. So I decided about 10 years ago, here's just an example of what you see when you Google image search Milwaukee. That wasn't the city I was seeing, that I grew up in or that I experienced. I just started carrying a camera around with me everywhere I went. I actually only recently got my first smartphone, like within the last couple months. So I'd carry a heavy camera around with me, taking photos, giving myself license and permission to commune with my path through the city. And I think for me, I just started taking these photos. I shared them in social media and in other settings. I found that kind of this alternative visual account of the city that I lived in a lot of ways, when I present them to people who live here, they feel much more truthful to the reality that they understand. So I've carried this camera with me. And now that everyone does, I feel like Instagram was new when I started doing this. So I actually love seeing how people see and sort of stamp a Milwaukee hashtag onto things. But this was kind of my way of saying, oftentimes we restrict, we limit, we dehumanize our environments by kind of looking to just what's the biggest bullhorn, what's the biggest, the images that are kind of also random cliched of our places. And then we sort of internalize those as who we are. And I think that just does a great disservice to the incredible reality to the city I live in. But I'm sure anyone could do that in their place, is kind of go beyond just what are the 12 images that everyone kind of has agreed are the ones that we present to represent ourselves.
Those are so beautiful. Thank you so much for starting us off with art and gorgeousness. Josh, how about you?
Well, I won't be able to follow up on what Adam just shared very well, but I will say that I find it really important as a practice to listen, and specifically to listen to people who aren't news hounds, who aren't following the blow by blow of political developments every day, and how they're talking about political news and their decisions about how or whether to act politically, and to listen to how they express this in their own words. So I'm part of a team at the Othering and Belonging Institute that carries out a lot of qualitative research, so focus groups, listening sessions, one-on-one interviews around the country with members of communities that have been chronically underrepresented and disenfranchised. So we carry out this research in partnership with local civic organizations in order to support them in developing strategies for reaching folks who are hard to reach, to get them engaged and involved. And we, of course, create written transcripts from these recordings and do the social science process of analyzing them. But I really always make a practice of actually listening to the audio recordings too, and being able to hear kind of the pauses and the breaks and the thinking, the reflection, the back and forth, and the ways people are working out the way they express themselves and their ideas, and kind of what's getting picked up from the elite narrative setting sphere and what just isn't relevant to people who are just engaging more sporadically and more living their lives as opposed to following them blow by blow all the time. So that's fun.
Great, thank you. It's interesting that you're bringing in the pauses and silences, and listening for the things unsaid as well as the things that are said. Phil, how about you? What's one of your favorite creative tools or practices?
I don't know if I would call this a favorite. It's sort of ingrained in the kind of work that I do. I'm a media researcher primarily. I've been actually doing, I research sort of the infrastructure that produces the journalistic narratives that we all engage with. And part and parcel of that has always been to engage in this process of comparing narratives. So it's more analytical and creative, I would say. So, I'm very fascinated by the differences we can see in the narratives that are produced around the same event or the same phenomenon. And that's probably what in part led me into wanting to research journalism and media, for all of these years, is that process. We've talked a lot, obviously, especially these days, it's reemerged, these conversations about whether there is anything, how legitimate is this notion of the norm of objectivity in journalism. And obviously today, when I do this process, so this, consuming narratives from different types of news and information sources, it's going to come as no surprise, obviously, that when I do this process now, I've never seen greater disparities, differences across different types of news and information sources that people rely upon, which goes to this question of, and this challenge we have today, of course, of there being sort of a core reality that can serve as the starting point for discussions about policy responses, for example. And so when I say it's not my favorite, thing to do anymore, because it's actually become a process that generates now for me some frustration, some anger. I think many of us have experienced this when, part of this process of being exposed to different narratives that you want to sort of try to get understanding of, is when you have family members who say, this is what I rely on. And you go there and you go, are you kidding? So it's a process. I hate to use the word favorite these days because it's become more of a source, I think, of concern and frustration than anything else. But it's obviously, given the kind of research that I do, it's not something that I can walk away from. But it's a discouraging part of my day to day, I would say.
Thank you, Phil. I feel like I could have also crafted this question as, what are your obsessions? Tell us about one of your obsessions. Courtney, how about you? Finish off this lightning round for us.
Sure. Greetings, everyone. I bring you hellos from scorching St. Louis, Missouri. It's so hot, but I know it's hot everywhere. One of my favorite things to do in my creative process is to see what else is out there, to tap into my network, touch base with colleagues that are at other foundations that are doing or approaching similar issues and addressing some of the same topics that we're doing. Oftentimes, I find myself sitting down and getting ready to create content that I know is not new. The idea is not new. So I like to do my own little personal research and see how the topic was covered before. How can we do it a different way? And just to see what other colleagues in the philanthropic space, what they're doing. I find a lot of value in that. So I call on my friends at Colorado Health and McKnight Foundation and other places that we find ourselves doing some of the same work, transitioning from a different CEO and finding creative ways to tell stories about the vision of that person or touching on the same topics from women's health to firearm violence. And so it's a little competitive spirit in there because it's really what's driving it is, okay, I wonder what this foundation has done and how can we tap into some of those resources and creative ideas, but put our own spin on it. So I would describe that as probably my most favorite thing to do when I'm getting ready to approach something creatively.
That's great. Thank you so much. All right, we're going to do another lightning round. We're doing great on time. This one will probably be a little deeper, but I'd love to hear from each of you one definition, concept, idea that is central to your work that you want to make sure anybody who's at this panel leaves with, has as a takeaway. So your takeaways, always you want to do them early so you can reinforce them throughout the time we have together. And this time we're going to go in the opposite direction. So we'll start with Courtney, then go to Phil, then Josh and Adam. So the question is what's one idea that you want that feels central to the work for you that you want to make sure people leave with? And I'll just do a quick modeling. In our definitions at Narrative Initiative, narrative is built both through action and through communication and storytelling. So when people do campaigns or make demands or go to protests or go to their city's budget meeting, those are ways, especially when you do them collectively, of not just taking action and advancing the thing that you want to move, but also of changing the story and then having a different part of the story to tell. So Courtney, how about you? What's a definition or framework or idea that you want to make sure we hold?
Oh, I have lots, but I think I'll share convening, bringing folks together, especially in the communication space. I think oftentimes when something happens, I'll use COVID-19, the pandemic, for example, everybody goes into play mode, full speed ahead, and we spend less time coordinating with folks. We have statewide reach, and we would much rather coordinate with the states and coordinate with other service providers and others that are doing communications work to target certain populations so that we're not duplicating efforts, we're sharing resources, and we're coming together in a really strong way. And so I think the best way, the more that we can focus on at the front end, coordinating and getting unified, maybe implementing some weekly meetings so we can talk about what our challenges are, how we're approaching them, what are some key messages that we want to spread far and wide so that everyone's speaking the same language and everyone is is using factual information. Do we have research? Can we share that? So just bringing folks together, I think is really important in the beginning. You don't want to be in the middle of the process or at the end and think about how we can partner up. And that's really special to our work. And it helps us drive change in a really, really significant way.
Great, thank you. So the organizing and the planning are as important as the doing. Phil, how about you?
Sure. I think the concept I want to talk a bit about is this concept of engagement. And I think the first thing to say right off the bat is I'm not coming at this with a textbook, a standard definition. And because in the work that I do, one of the things that's been most fascinating is to watch how this concept of engagement has been defined differently and put into practice differently and prioritized differently across the range of different types of organizations that I study. But within the context that I'm talking about right now, it's this idea of the measurable indicators of success that are used these days when it comes to individual news stories. And it is a reflection of the way our media ecosystem has evolved, and the fact that news outlets today have such a vast array of data points related to the performance of the stories that they produce. So when we're talking, and so, we used to talk primarily in terms of this idea of exposure, right? How many eyeballs were reached? Well, that's just the starting point now for how we understand how people engage with news and information. So we're talking, of course, about things like how much time is spent, how many comments or likes or shares does a news story generate. And the reason this becomes particularly important to our understanding of sort of issues of narrative today is because all of this becomes vitally important feedback that then cycles back into and has a huge influence over the decision-making about the kinds of news stories that are produced, the narrative frames that are used, going forward. And one of the frustrating things about what we have learned, unfortunately, today in this day and age, is that the type of stories and narratives that are most engaging, that perform best on these criteria today that are so influential in news organization decision-making, are unfortunately not necessarily the most informative stories. That engagement unfortunately correlates quite strongly with things that make you angry, that sow division, that facilitate polarization, and unfortunately also that disseminate misinformation or disinformation. These are all unfortunately reasonably good strategies for enhancing engagement. So it's as this concept has taken such a hold in our media ecosystem, it's had some damaging effects on the kind of news and information that is produced. And it's unfortunate that in this case, knowing more about your audience and how they're behaving and how they're being affected is actually having some negative consequences. There are some positive ones as well, but the negative ones have proven to be quite profound in this environment that news and information circulates in now.
Yeah, thanks, Phil, for taking us into the realm of the systems of narrative production and distribution. You can have all the people organized and have incredible content, but if you can't get it seen and can't get it repeated, then those are real obstacles to setting new narrative themes and to moving on those together. Josh, how about you?
Yeah, thanks. I'll say something about the concept of narrative itself, I think, and its relationship to facts and data. So, something that I've noticed is, of course, the term narrative is being used a lot more widely by a kind of broader array of folks. And increasingly, I hear it used as a way of calling a particular account or a particular thing into question or dismissing it. So saying like, oh, that's just a narrative, right? And then the inverse follows from that sometimes. The idea that if an account, like a media account, for example, deploys facts or data, then it's not a narrative. It's true or just reality. But to interpret something as a narrative isn't about evaluating whether it's true or whether it's false. I see interpreting and analyzing accounts as narrative as being about paying attention to how events, facts, and data are appropriated into a story selectively. So how they're picked out, how they're put in order and woven together into something that appears coherent, in part because it's leaving other things out, right? So maybe I'm talking about silences again, like you said, Rinku, the last sense. But so, a narrative admits and enlists certain data points, certain facts, filters them in and fits them to a particular plot structure while filtering other facts out. So the analysis of an account as a narrative is about understanding what are the terms of entry, what gets selected and enlisted into the story. And I think this is important, and it's something I've been applying and thinking a lot about lately with respect to the way stories of elections are told by elite narrative setters in particular. So whether that's in media or otherwise, and how there are biases built into the kinds of plots that they look to narrate around elections and then select data through them. So data or facts are more likely to get to be a part of the story if they can depict things like big partisan shifts, over partisan stability that comes with turnout changes, which can be, equally relevant and important kinds of dynamics. And which of these register in a media account really matters because it leads to some types of voters or some actions of voters being cast as the central and the consequential ones, and it writes others out of the story. And the narrative that prevails about which voters won or lost an election has actual tangible consequences. There are real stakes. Because it positions certain voter groups to have influence, to be heard, and then come next election to receive, investment, to be courted by campaigns, and to be seen as consequential constituencies, in contrast to others.
Yeah, I want to point to something here in narrative definition, which is that when we say the word narrative, we're often talking about the themes and ideas that are communicated through stories. And stories always have certain elements. They have characters, they have a setting, they have a plot. Things happen in the story. And part of the critical activity, the analytic activity that we want all news consumers and consumers of entertainment to be able to take apart is how are those stories crafted? Who are the characters and how are they presented? And what do they want? What's the quest here? When you learn about storytelling in different formats, one of the things I've learned or figured out as a writer is I think there might only actually be one plot, the quest plot, which is that a person or a group of people want something. And in all of the stories we hear with that plot in it, the morals are different. The ideas being advanced are different. So even though stories have a traditional structure quite often, and familiarity of story helps with people being able to hear the story, the point of the story comes through all the perspectives that we bring to it. Adam, how about you? What's a definition or framework that's important to you that we should not leave today without?
Yeah, I'm really steeped in the world of local media, local news, co-producing local narrative with people. And I fear a little bit that Phil has exposed what I'm about to say as being really naive, but something that I reinforce in the newsroom that I'm a part of is that, sometimes the audience will be fed up with how much trauma, how much drama, how much crime and conflict define narratives of communities of color in our city. And this isn't just true in Milwaukee. This is true all over the place. It kind of misses most of the reality. And people will say, why can't we hear good news? Why isn't there a media outlet that just tells the good stories? And what I reinforce in my newsroom is that the opposite of only reporting bad news isn't only reporting good news. It's reporting the whole complex story, which may not be good for business. So that's my caveat. So I just want to offer too that, but then how do you operationalize that? How do you actually go beyond? How do you seek complex narratives, especially in communities that have earned, the media doesn't deserve their good faith because of how they've been abused and mistreated, oftentimes through how reporting typically works in those places and in the communities that I'm a part of. And I think to me, what it boils down to then is trust. So if you want to go beyond just how do you create, and to the point that Courtney made before around convening, is you have to build relationships over time. You have to slow down. It can't be, I'm just dropping in, I'm parachuting in, a camera will come and point at someone on the worst day of their life or at a fire, and that does make compelling content for people. But you can't just try the same strategies when you're doing good news. You can't just go and say, today is the best day of your life, show us your joy. It has to, those kinds of stories need to emanate from an authentic relationship, because if you're just doing good news, sometimes you have a way of flattening in a way that's just almost as exploitive and reinforcing of those negative ways of reporting. Just an example, those 1 in a million stories, we're hearing them right now because it's graduation season, of the kid who overcame their neighborhood, overcame their community. You're actually indicting their community in the process of telling that story by saying, if they're 1 in a million, or they're a diamond in the rough, are you saying all their friends, their family, their context is the rough? So I think for me, and that's kind of the frame I like to use, is that, in telling the whole story, there will absolutely be stories of joy. And you also have to be careful about not fetishizing struggle, because that's another thing that can happen when we tell stories about communities of color in this country. But yeah, of not just saying if we're inundated with bad news, we need to inundate ourselves with good news, but rather to slow down, to see community is slow. Good stories are slow and require time. So I think, that's what the concept I wanted to share to start.
Thank you. Appreciate that. All right, let's move into our first substantive question. I'm curious about how each of you has seen journalism and media coverage change over the last 5 years, either the coverage or any other aspect of those fields that you want to lift up for us. And how have those changes affected actual civic engagement, how people think about civic life and civic responsibility? And Phil, I think here I'm going to start with you, and just for the panel, you can lean into any question you want and lean away from any question you want. So just let me know that you feel like passing if you don't want to address something. So Phil, how about you? 5 years, what changes have you seen?
Sure, and I'm going to focus, because I think that the changes that we're seeing are actually different at the national level and at the local level. And I'm going to focus, a lot of my research has been on the changes in local journalism. And probably at the most basic level, the biggest change is just the less of it, just dramatically less of it, in terms not only of what we've all heard about, closures of local news sources and lost jobs, but those outlets that are operate as just skeletons oftentimes of what they once were. And so we're actually seeing the content change. We're seeing local news that's far less local, that is actually not often about the community that it's supposedly, the outlet is supposedly serving, but more often being content that's being ported in from elsewhere. News tends to flow from large markets to small markets, so it's always, sort of more economical to actually not do genuinely local journalism, unfortunately, but rather to share content produced for larger markets, and then less original. There's, many of these outlets today that call themselves local news sources, and we're doing some studies now of some of these new hyper-local news networks that are popping up, and very little of it is original reporting. So it's, so the economic base for that kind of production is diminished dramatically. But to the consequences, we have at this point such an incredible laundry list of empirical relationships that we need to be concerned about. As local news declines in a community, we see all sorts of indicators of civic engagement drop, whether it's voting in local elections, whether it's even we see greater polarization in the voting patterns when local news goes away. Knowledge about civic knowledge diminishes. The list is actually quite extensive. So so that just decline in the production of local news and information by news organizations is something that we're seeing very significant consequences.
Can I jump in here?
Of course, please.
So I agree with what Phil said. We were seeing that in Missouri. The journalistic landscape was just as you described, and we have some really local gems here. We have the University of Missouri School of Journalism in Columbia, Missouri, home of the Association of Healthcare Journalists. We have the St. Louis American here in St. Louis, which is one of the only Black papers still surviving, full color, has been around for a long time. So we had some local gems here, but the infrastructure was really dwindling. And the school is and was producing journalists. They were not staying in Missouri. And so the stories, like Phil referenced, were not of local families, not of local communities. Residents in Missouri could not see themselves in those stories, and therefore it was not resonating with them. And so that's where we came in as a foundation. What can we do? We look at communications, we look at journalism as a change-making tool, as an aspect of our work that has to touch every issue. It's very important to us moving the needle, to us driving change. So what can we do? And we started having conversations with David Russo and the team at Kaiser, thinking about how can we start to establish our own journalistic infrastructure and have something strong, reliable, trust that was already that reputation of trusted voice there with Kaiser. How can we bring that here locally? And we created the Kaiser Midwest Bureau, and we have reporters here in our building that are housed here that are our reporters. I claim them as ours. We don't have any editorial control over what the stories that they tell, but we do have the connections. We've been in this work a long time. We can point them in the right direction, and we can partner with them when they're trying to bust down those doors and investigate and get that narrative out there. And that's what we've been doing, and it's been a value. And we've seen those stories show up in the St. Louis American. We've seen those stories show up in the local news, St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and our local NPR station. So it's spreading, and those stories are being elevated. Missourians, St. Louisans, all these small counties, and what's happening with hospital closures and stories that just were not being told or that others were afraid to investigate and tell, they're happening now. And it's opening up this door and this conversation that journalism, it is changing. And we, as I'm going to use this term just this one time because that we don't like to call ourselves this, but we as funders or philanthropic leaders or philanthropic institutions in this space, we need to figure out what our role is and how we can step in and continue to elevate so that the stories on the issues that needs to be told can be told.
If I could just jump in real quick, and I don't need to take too much time with this for fear of redundancy. That's the story of Milwaukee Neighborhood News Service, Courtney, that you just laid out, responding to some of what Phil had. So I've been working at my organization for about 10 years, and that's the exact arc that we've played, where we distribute our content. We were a big role of how we were founded was driven by the philanthropic sector, seeing the need, if they're investing in communities, that if those stories also aren't having narratives emanating from them that reflect the reality, that they're not getting as much value as they can out of it. And then we've had a very similar arc in what we've done. And just to underscore something Phil said as well, is that watchdog role, the bigger papers in Milwaukee, there aren't folks embedded in school board meetings and city and county meetings and state government, as boring as licenses, permits, and budgets are, I mean, those create the reality of community members, right? And as flashy as national stories can be, those local stories are what oftentimes really matter, and oftentimes they aren't very sexy. And I think that's a challenge. So that question of how, as the traditional model of journalism has clearly already been broken, how there can be different innovative solutions. I feel lucky to be embedded in one. And Courtney, what you're describing is something that I hope we see replicated in places around the country, which is it's not in the same way. We're not going to get back the 100,000 manufacturing jobs that we lost. We're also not just going to get back a bunch of news people subscribing to having the paper delivered to them every day. So how do we actually change with the times and meet community where they are?
Thank you so much, Adam. I just have to say, as a moderator, the absolute best thing is when you don't have to call on anybody. So, but Josh, I want to see if you want to get in on this question before we go to the next one.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. Yeah, no, I'm really grateful and appreciative to Courtney and Phil and Adam for what they just articulated, because I realized that what I was going to say is actually very specific to national news coverage. And so I feel like what we've just heard, it kind of points us in the direction of correctives or solutions to what I was going to speak about. But I was just going to note that, in a lot of in media coverage in general, we see national partisan politics really occupying a much larger share of news coverage, at least in national news over the past 5 years. And with that, we see more and more this idea of the country as deeply divided and deeply polarized out there. And that comes out, in coverage that is specifically about the issue of polarization, that makes that the subject matter. But even more often, I see polarization, division being treated as kind of a taken for granted background in reporting. And more subtly, we also get the message from a lot of political reporting and what's being covered and how it's being covered, that all of us, everyone in the country, is kind of consumed by this partisan political blow by blow, and that it's important to all of our identities. And when I say partisan political, I mean in national partisan politics. So, for example, the description of people and places as being blue, red, Trump country, left and right, etc., has really become ubiquitous, and not just in cable news, and not just with pundits. But isn't the country divided or polarized? Yes. I mean, in certain ways, absolutely. But in other ways, not as much as it seems. And kind of to what Adam said earlier, it's not about bad narrative. It's about having a complete and nuanced narrative as the solution to bad narrative. I think that's what Adam was saying. So for one, we know from research that the political junkies and the people who are following the blow by blow are a minority in the country. The majority of people in the United States are not scoreboard obsessed partisans who are demanding this kind of coverage of every palace intrigue, right? And second, we also know that polarization is less about distance on actual policy issues and disagreement on that, and more about people's dislike or distrust for the other side in who they are or who they perceive them to be. So there's a book title, or a book that was inspired by this, that's called Uncivil Agreement, by a political scientist called Liliana Mason. So the polarization is actually different than the way that it's portrayed. But now, turning back to media narratives, we're starting to see evidence that in the United States, more and more that people perceive others as these kinds of political junkies, and see engagement with politics as this realm of political junkies and people who are following constantly, it actually makes polarization much worse. So first, this impression increases kind of animosity between partisans. So you have studies showing, for example, that when partisan voters are exposed to news about polarization or to the idea that we're polarized, that tends to increase their animus towards those who vote the other way, those who are on the other side. So of course they're consuming news that says we're polarized. They're saying to themselves, I'm not extreme. I'm not doing this. The other side is doing this. So there's an increase in animus. And then relatedly, there's also some really new research that I saw just recently showing that partisan voters tend to overestimate how engaged or invested or intense people on the other side are. And that overestimation is part of what drives animus towards the other side. So seeing the other side as obsessed with politics and being political junkies. And then second, there's this impression of politics as being the realm of people who are obsessed in this way drives a lot of other people out. So it leads people to withdraw from engaging at all. And we see this coming up a lot in the research that we do at the Other Animal Belonging Institute that I mentioned earlier, with people who don't have strong partisan leanings or consistent patterns of political participation. They don't want to be seen as political. They don't want people to think of them as being about politics. And they're just kind of averse to the conversation, and that has to do with the impression of, okay, politics is this, arena of blood sport where, you have to follow everything, be obsessed with it, and it, creates friction between people. So I don't want to place all of this on journalists and the media, but I do think that there's a lot of reason to reflect on how the idea of the public as hyper-political and partisanized gets perpetuated by media accounts, especially when we know that on a lot of significant policy issues, there is actually more agreement than might be portrayed.
Thank you so much, Josh. So it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. You say that we are polarized and people feel more polarized because of it. I saw a study, I think it might be one of the ones you're talking about, Josh, that interestingly showed that on either side, our focused attention on the other side and like having a common enemy also has and feeling like enemy is the right word, not opponent or citizen or neighbor, having that doesn't actually make us love the people on our own side more, which is interesting to me. So not only is the relationship between people with different kinds of politics fraying, the relationship of people with the same kind of politics is also fraying because, well, I don't know entirely why, but I thought that was a really interesting and not good outcome of the polarization debate. I want to move us to our second question. And then after that, I think we'll try to start getting some, drawing in some of the questions from the audience. So on our second question, what do you think are some of the ways that we can equip young people, especially, not exclusively, but especially, equip them to be able to discern through the torrents of lies and misinformation that is out there? So both the deliberate kind and the, oh, I just didn't realize that was wrong kind. How do we equip students and young people with the skills and tools that they need to be able to tell what's for real and what's not, and to be able to manage their own consumption? And here I think maybe Adam, we'll start with you and then go to Courtney. Courtney, Phil, Josh. Adam, Courtney, Phil, Josh.
Sure. So on just one biographical note, I actually studied math and philosophy in college, and then I hurtled myself into a career in broadcasting as a radio producer. And all of a sudden, my diet of media went from kind of slow and measured and controlled to it being binges constantly. And And then I started seeing my career. This was maybe 12, 13 years ago. I saw the advent of Twitter and this torrent that you're describing start that kind of fire hose, go from it being a garden hose of information to that fire hose and that torrent. And just a concept that I was biking through my town thinking about was this idea of being obese but malnourished, which is a uniquely American invention. The idea that you can consume so many calories that your body is obese, but that you're malnourished at the same time. And as I was thinking about that idea, I realized that's true too of the information we consume. I like that you use the word consume because it is consumption, and it is, so I think we're obese but malnourished in our information. But and not to take us on an aside here, but I think that's also true of our relationships. I mean, some of the most lonely people I know have the most robust social media lives, have the most friends, have the most interactions there, but have this sort of howling emptiness inside of themselves that they can't fill. And so to me, if we do take that metaphor of being obese but malnourished, I mean, just a piece of it, just slow down. And that was like the first thing that came to mind is actually consuming less on some levels, be more discerning about what you're consuming. And that's kind of implied in the question of being more critical about it. So that question of like, how can you, so you're not just obese, but you're malnourished. How can you get more nutrients? So starting to have a more critical thought about where you're sourcing. Not also too, I mean, I see so many people just sharing headlines they agree with. I mean, they're literally not even clicking into I feel like there should be a reading test when you share a link to say, like, what did the last paragraph say? So I think that of slowing down, things being also too, like, one of the reasons that we get so malnourished is that people are consuming way too much processed food. So how do you have like food that's or information that's produced more organically? Sorry, I'm getting a little lost in the analogy, but then also the idea of exercise. And I was sort of puzzling over whether I should invest the time to unpack this analogy a little bit, like the thought of, what is a exercise to a body? So what is exercise in the context of information? I think to me, I thought of a few different things, but really it's dialogue and discourse with people that you trust, that that you have relationships with. I think one of the things that leads to us being so obese is that for a lot of people, it's not just consuming media, it's also engaging in the scrum, in the free-for-all of the comment sections, of dunking on people you don't like. And both sides do this, like to an extreme degree. And I think of having actual relationships with people that can unfold and evolve as you discuss and embrace the doubt that you feel within the information or the narratives that you might subscribe to yourself. So I think like less consumption, slowing down, finding those nutrients that are maybe locally sourced and organic, and then also exercising those muscles of dialogue, of discourse, which I think are kind of the same ones of the civic realm and of those kinds of engagements that we've been discussing throughout this panel. So sorry, I feel like everyone else is so research based, but that was kind of that kind of maybe artistic frame of thinking about being obese but malnourished is the first thing that came to mind in response to this question.
All good, no worries. I've forgotten the order that I put you all in, but I think Courtney's next, and then Josh and Phil. Go for it, Courtney.
Adam, we appreciate your artistic perspective. Don't ever mistake it. But
Thank you.
I think that from where I sit in the institution that I represent, in order for us to start to unpack how children take in information or what they need to not take in so much or what the parameters are, we need to think about how we don't value the perspective of children. And if we think about the issues that they come in when we want to have this more vulnerable narrative, when we really want the world to shift because we want everyone to just open up because the children are our future. that's great, but where are they in the beginning of that thought process? So in media, or as a change maker, as we think about campaigns, I'll use big media campaigns that we often attach to our work. If we're doing census, if we're educating about census, or if we're educating about firearm suicide, or Medicaid expansion, where's the trusted voice of the child in there? Where's the trusted messenger that is the child? Where are they in this whole creative buildup, in this whole creative process? We spend a lot of time and money on research and polling, and but we never think about talking to children and getting their aspects, their perspectives, and where does that fit into the work? And so, and I think maybe if we start there, then maybe we can start to see what information is out there and how they can be wrapped into that. But it's so much information out there, a real clear-cut answer on how we break through the white noise and get the most factual information to land and resonate. I really don't have an answer for that, but I do think that there's always a way that we can work the child perspective in and make their voice just a little bit more prominent.
And one quick thing, I just went and got something I keep on my desk as a reminder to myself of the point you just made, Courtney. I was at a conference run by well-meaning, very woke, cool, hip adults about young people's issues, and a bunch of young people were sitting at the tables. I was sitting with some young people, and when they left, I looked at what they were writing down, and someone had drawn this picture. It's backwards, but they drew some fish and they wrote, "So what?" They had been sitting at this conference that was ostensibly for them and their attitudes and opinions, and they had so few valves for input. There was so little engagement there that I keep this on my table as a reminder of, even when you have that sensibility as adults to engage with young people, you have to also then understand it's not just a one-way thing of, we're going to sit down and lecture you about what you need to know, because they're going to turn off real quick, and that's our fault, not theirs.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, Josh, go for it. You're ready. Go ahead.
Sorry, yeah, I was trying to do you that favor you referred to earlier of not having to call on people, because what I heard and what Courtney and Adam said really kind of resonated. Again, to refer back to the research we do at the Othering and Belonging Institute, we do a lot of listening sessions, focus groups, et cetera, with young people, especially those that are kind of ambivalent about voting, to learn about their perspectives and their views on civic engagement. And most of the work that we do focuses on Black and Latinx young people. So, not children, but people who are of voting age, say 18 to 30. And one of the things that we hear the most, possibly the thing that we hear the most as a determining factor about whether to vote or not, is, I don't follow those things closely enough to participate. There's so much information, to the water hose point. I can't make sense of what's what. So, it's better for me to not participate than to just put random things down on a ballot, or just simply like, I'm not that kind of person. I don't know enough. And so there are a few things that I think are worth saying about this, very, very prominent pattern that we see. One is that, these are young people who, they're not voting consistently, but they take voting very seriously, and they actually maybe take it more seriously than a lot of people who do vote. They see elections as consequential. Elections matter, and so they don't, they think that it matters if they're not informed enough, and they end up, quote unquote, voting wrong. I see this as a sign that they're pretty discerning, actually, about the information that they are consuming. Often, when we hear this, they say, there's so much information out there, and I try to, read and do my research, but it's just too much, and I can't get my head around all of it, so I don't participate. And then, probably the most important thing that I see in this is that, this is the result of the denigration of these young people's knowledge and their perspectives and their views and their ability to exercise their voice. And, we see it as a product of their voices and their perspectives having been othered, being pushed outside, being told that they're not ready, they're not, prepared, and that they don't belong. So, from that, I know we're, kind of talking about disinformation, but I think that what we take from that and the lessons that I see that are maybe more important dovetail with sort of what Courtney was saying about making space for those voices. Voter education and information, certainly. You need to demystify the ballot, but you also need to demystify voters and the electorate. So, take away this idea that everyone else that is voting is like reading every source and, knows everything about all of the issues. They don't. And then, anchor these young people in something else, in a different kind of credential, because they have the credentials to participate civically. They're thinking deeply. They know what their community needs. They're connected to community. So this is one thing that we also often say that we should be using as part of the message, anchoring people in a notion of community, anchoring people, young people especially, in their understanding of right and wrong, because they do have that. And in their commitment to showing up for their community and lifting up their voice on behalf of their community.
Thank you, Josh. Phil?
Sure. I think this is such an important question because it gets at the fact that we really do have to treat our current situation and the current problems we're facing and the solutions as generational. And by that, in other words, we have to acknowledge that it is going to take that kind of time. And that indeed we have to accept the reality that there's been a generation or two of news consumers who we've kind of lost, whose patterns and practices are going to be very difficult to change, and so are going to be part of the problem and not part of the solution. And to get more specific with this, the most damaging thing, and I've said this before in other contexts, over the past decade and a half, was the adoption, and this was a phrase that actually emerged from a focus group with young people about a decade and a half ago, and it was the notion that if the news is that important, it will find me. And that's the thing we need to change with this next generation of young people, is we don't think about, in media scholarship, we often talk about active versus passive media consumers and push versus pull media. And we all embrace this notion that sort of the online realm was this inherently more active space for us as content creators and news consumers, et cetera. But in reality, as the way, when we layered social media on top, there's nothing more passive. I mean, the epitome of passivity used to be sitting in front of the television, watching TV on the couch. That was the couch potato. I would argue that the person scrolling through their social media feed is an even more passive news consumer. They are sort of abdicating the decision making about what's important to their network of friends and family members and to a set of curation algorithms. Just the process of walking down the driveway to pick up a printed newspaper that used to lie there, that is a more active engagement with news than what most people or a lot of people do today. And it is the source of a lot of the vulnerabilities to misinformation, to polarizing content, and also to this misperception, really, that there is all this information out there, because we can't have both scenarios be true. We can't have this collapse of the economic model of journalism on the one hand, and this sort of torrent of news and information on the other that people can't seem to handle anymore. Because the reality is, and this is what we have to train people to be able to do, to recognize that 90% of that isn't information, isn't news. It's a reflection of the fact that, yes, the barriers to entry to communicate have dropped dramatically, but there's the ratio of going back to Adam's metaphor of sort of what's nourishing and valuable versus what's junk and crap is off the charts. And so I think what we end up with are people, the other dichotomy that's important to remember is this idea that we've got today. There are still those people who feel like they are uninformed, that they don't know. But then I think we've got this growth of people who are misinformed, and that's a very different thing. People who think they are on the ball and they understand what's happening, and in reality they are more dangerous to the democratic process than the uninformed. The uninformed tended to just stay home and not participate. The misinformed behave in ways that are often counter to their very own best interests. So, this is the generational shift. So all this goes back to what I think is the key here. What we need to teach news consumers, young ones, is to be active seekers out of news and information, not passive recipients. And because the reality is, when we go back to that model, what we consume changes dramatically. I wrote a piece just a week or so back about the failure of Donald Trump's blog. Think about that. A traditional blog, even with a someone who is as prominent a public figure, that blog could not generate enough traffic to bother to continue doing it, absent all of the social media amplifications that are so central to how our media ecosystem works today. That was a good old-fashioned pull medium. You had to go online, you had to seek out the blog and read it. And if Donald Trump can't make that, go viral, of course, nobody can. But that's exactly what we want to not dictate what people consume news-wise, is what has the capacity to go viral. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Phil. It feels important to point out that there are a couple of things that we know does not work. Like, there are things that if we do them, it won't result in young people or anybody becoming seekers of news in this way that Phil is talking about. So one of those is you can't yell data at people who have consumed the wrong thing and believed it. So a way a thing not to do with young people, or really anybody who has been caught up in fake news, is to yell the real news at them. All you're going to do is reinforce the fake news by making them feel stupid and like they have to hold on to what they think they know. So just like yelling a bunch of data at people and the truth is ineffective and might actually have the opposite effect. And it seems to me it's relationships and experiences that will train up the next generation and get everybody in the current generations that we can get. Relationships and experiences. Okay, I'm going to go to a question from the audience here. We have 3 or 4 good ones. So panel doesn't all have to weigh in, and maybe I'll ask us to try to do responses in about 2 minutes when we respond, so we can try to get to most of these. So the first question is points to the central challenges of COVID communication being that of moving people from an individual mindset to a collective mindset. But reporting on disparate impact in communities of color often worked counter to the collective mindset, as in white people said, well, that's not me, so I can travel. I remember a news story based in the South from last spring, late spring or even summer. I forget what the event was, but some big social cultural event. And people saying, well, it's mostly hitting, Black people and brown people and immigrants, and I'm not them. So I'm going to go to this gigantic gathering in the middle of a pandemic shutdown. So reporting on disparate impact often didn't work to feed the collective vibe. Can we craft collective responsibility while also addressing disparate impact? So can we talk about specific groups of people and how they're affected by things without driving people away from that group of people. Your thoughts as researchers and organizers?
I think we need to get away from the black and white aspect of equity in stories and narratives and understand that everything is not anecdotal. So you need to do research, even at the very lowest level. If you are creating COVID-19 communications or you're targeting groups, you need to have polling focus groups and representative samples of the groups that you're trying to speak to. It's not just black and white with the COVID communications. We found in our research that it's white populations in certain areas outside of our main cities and counties that are also challenged with information access and understanding and trusting what is being put out about this vaccine. So I think oftentimes, even and with media, we make assumptions. And I'll use, even on our firearm violence work, we did media messaging research with the Frameworks Institute, and it was over a few years. And we've been able to share that research with media institutions who are reporting on these issues. Now, journalists don't necessarily like to get messaging documents and be told how to say, but there is something with not traumatizing folks and really knowing how to get away from these historical narratives that we've really filled our mind with. There's a lot of lived experience that does need to be considered and go into this, but we need to get away from this feeling or this understanding or this concept that equity is just rural and urban and black and white, and how we can lift up stories in other populations, especially within the majority populations, or those that don't think that they experience some of the same challenges or have limited access to information or to other things, because it is out there. So I'll leave it at that, my 2 minutes.
Thank you. Anyone else want to get in here? Racial disparities in the effort to go from individual to collective thinking and how we deal with them.
I have too much to say about that. I really appreciate what you just said, Courtney, and a term that you use there is experience. I mean, I live in a city that has one of the most racially segregated in terms of our living patterns of any city in the country, and also, but more troubling than that, wealth disparity. We have some of the largest rates of wealth disparity. So we've literally subsidized through our highways and our civic investments this separation. So as the question it absorbs into itself, like there are people who live a mile from each other, whose worlds, they could live 1,000 miles from each other, and it would almost be the same phenomenon. And I think, to me, where I'm part of a group named Rural Urban Flow here in Wisconsin that's building connection between folks living in rural spaces and urban spaces through dialogue, experience, through play together, through kind of experiencing each other's worlds and being invited into each other's spaces, so that it's not for a person who grew up in the city like me. I can go and be on a farm and it not feel transgressive, not feel like I'm trespassing in someone else's place. And I think, to me, I mean, I don't see how that scales. I think sometimes we try to scale things too quickly and then we destroy things that are authentic. But I think people really do need to find ways to experience each other in authentic ways. And I know that's kind of a hand wavy answer to this, but the way that we undehumanize each other is by humanization, and that really has to happen, a lot of it in person, in my opinion.
Well, one of the things that we noticed with our research was people were saying, with COVID, when we were figuring out how to message around COVID, and when we polled the participants living in the more rural areas, they said, well, figured this was a big city issue. And then it started to come out, well, we don't want to be told what to do. And so that's how we built our messaging. So we have messaging for Black folks, messaging for Latino folks, messaging for white folks. We had to have different threads of messaging. It wasn't all the same. It didn't all come out to us the same. The way it was revealed, there were different attitudes and perceptions. And it's really mind-blowing, because I think the anecdotal attitudes and perceptions that we as our own people may have thought about our own people or populations that we belong to, it came out a little differently. And so I would just say, if you're able to have research that can really speak to what's happening in your communities, in your states, in the populations right outside your door, then that's most valuable.
Yeah, thank you. And I think the big point here is that communication isn't about the messenger, it's about the listener. And just in my own experience working with social justice and racial justice organizations all over the country, I do find that the audience question, who is your audience? What do you know about them? What do you want them to feel? What do you want them to do? What do they value? Which of those values do you share and can connect on? I think as a set of civically engaged people and citizens, we could be and strategists, we could be a lot more rigorous about our audience focus and a lot more rigorous about those strategies. And I want to lift up something that actually John Powell crafted some years ago. It's the idea of targeted universalism, that the goal is you have a universal goal for everybody to be healthy, but for each particular community in that universe, they might need some specific things in order to reach that goal, which enables you to craft programs that are designed to reverse racial disparities or get rid of the obstacles that create racial disparities and so on. I'm going to move us to the next question because we have two more good ones. This one is from Roundtable member Bobby Milstein. I'm just going to read it out. Joshua offered a terrific explanation about why there is an exhausted majority, in quotes, across the country. What are some examples of state-of-the-art efforts to connect with that majority who are in fact less polarized and more inclined to work across boundaries for everyone's well-being? If in fact there is a middle in between these polarized sets of people, how do we reach them and who's doing a good job of that? Go for it, Phil.
I had no plan to do this, but I'm going to go ahead and plug some of the work of my colleague here at Duke, a guy named Chris Bale. And he has a new book out called Breaking the Social Media Prism. But what the book describes are actually these tools that he's developed for how we access to help us when we access news and information online, actually to help sort of better surface, because as I was mentioning before, there's so much about sort of the online ecosystem that favors those at the extremes. And he is developing tools essentially to help surface the communication and the opinions and the analysis and the online participation amongst those who actually operate in that middle space to help that portion of the dialogue, generate more of the attention that it should. I wish I could remember more of the details about the different types of, but these are essentially apps that you could, download to your phone, use on your laptop, but are ways that he hopes will become also things that the platforms themselves ultimately embrace and use to try to do just that, sort of move away from the the ways in which so much of our news and information ecosystem favors the polarizing versus the compromising, so to speak. So there's my plug.
Great resource. Just to repeat it, the book is called Breaking the Social Media Prism. Josh, I'm wondering if you have anything on this front.
Yeah, thanks, Rinku. Really appreciate the question, the reference to the exhaustive majority being one to the research by More in Common, I assume. So I'm grateful to the audience member who's familiar with that work. More in Common does some good research, and the Othering Belong Institute works with them quite extensively. The thing that I want to push in responding to the question, I want to push back a little bit against the idea that who's in this exhaustive majority can be characterized as the middle or centrists, moderates, etc. That's the correct way to be thinking about this group. I think that it's important to recognize that this also, there's some of that, but it's also people who can't be easily categorized on a left-right political spectrum, and we shouldn't reify that political spectrum in the way that we talk about this group, because it does include people who, have a mix of views, who are maybe not tuned in consistently, who are not engaging with public opinion surveys in the ways that, political science classes tell us that we should expect people to. It also includes people who have been chronically marginalized, pushed out, disenfranchised, or who are simply disconnected from civic organizations and civic infrastructure. So that's where I'm going to go for the state of the art here, which is to this kind of efflorescence of especially Black, Latinx, Asian American, Native American led civic engagement organizations that are working year round, not just on the election cycles, to engage people who haven't historically been brought into the process, people who, in the analyses of most campaigns, they're considered, unlikely voters, low propensity voters is a term that's used a lot. And they're committing to engaging these folks and bringing them in, mobilizing them around values, around community, to get involved. So, I don't want to get into too long of a list. We partner with a lot of organizations who do this kind of work at the Othering Belong Institute, and you can go to our webpage and check it out. But I would point to those organizations as key.
Yeah, this may be timely moment to point out that the Pillars Fund, which is a philanthropy, a foundation that is looking to strengthen Muslim American communities, has just put out 3 really interesting initiatives that are designed to change the narrative around Muslims in this country and actually put Muslim Americans in relationship with other kinds of Americans and raise the voice of Muslim people through art and media and other things. I think they too are looking for ways to get past the hard polarization and just put Muslim people in front of other people and let the process play out from there. So doing a little bit less mediation and more encouragement of direct interaction and direct production. Does anyone else want to get in on this question? Otherwise, I will go to the next one.
I'll mention real quickly in the network I'm involved in that I mentioned of Rural Urban Flow. We had a whole series of dialogues planned with a group named Local Voices Network of dialogues within our side. So in Milwaukee County and Sauk County. And then when the pandemic came and everyone moved on to Zoom for everything, in a weird way, that was a blessing in disguise for us to be able to have dialogues across our places. So we had people sitting in farmland and people sitting in cities, having conversations with each other for the first time in ways that were, again, I like using the words that were kind of unsexy and slow and really listening oriented. And a lot of those were really powerful. So, and to a point Courtney made before, one of them, we explored the experiences of people of color in rural spaces, were based in those spaces, which isn't the narrative that you think of when you think of Wisconsin or even across the country. But there's so many, those kinds of experience could come out when we slowed down and found different venues to engage with each other.
Thank you, Adam. I have a question from the audience for Courtney specifically. So I'm gonna read this one. It is, what are your thoughts about how well philanthropy engages in the public narrative in ways that are mindful of power vis-a-vis community grantees, mindful of power differentials vis-a-vis community grantees, that many in philanthropy are beginning to recognize and address?
That's a really good question. It's hard. Yes, and it is something that lots more of us are paying attention to. I think it needs to be done strategically. I think that there is value in having work on a continuum that is targeted and that is community led. And what that means to be community led, I don't think that it's just this one definition. I think it's on a case by case basis, depending on what goals you're trying to accomplish, who you're partnering with, and the outcomes that you're seeking. I think there is this movement where, okay, philanthropy holds this huge power dynamic, and when you're in the room, that's still not community led. Well, I represent philanthropy, and I do think that there is some value sometimes with having us in the room. I'm sorry, I'm going to say it again. I represent philanthropy, and I feel really strongly about those times when it's necessary for us to be in the room and still have that community-led impact. It can still happen. It needs to be better coordination, more dialogue, two-way dialogue. And yes, we as institutions in philanthropy, we need to be flexible. We need to be emergent. We need to not box ourselves in and not have so many parameters and checks and everything that these organizations that we want to partner with to move the needle have to do. So I know everyone is taking a note from Jeff Bezos, his ex-wife, and what she was able to do in that real charitable way. But there's a difference between charity and what strategies drive charitable work and what drives strategic philanthropy. And it's not all the same. And so it's a time and place for both. We just have to have real healthy, productive conversations. And I think that there needs to be this view, even in community, that we are a resource. We're not just a bank. We come to the table with way more change-making aspects to our work, like health policy and convening and research and learning, that we would like to present in the universe and be productive. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. I'm going to move us to our last question, and apologies to those in the audience whose questions I don't get to. I am going to read out the last two questions from the audience just in case anyone on the panel wants to address any of these ideas in my last question. So this is background. I think we did this one. Okay. How can we get, it's actually one question from the audience, and then I'll frame our final. This is the one we didn't really get to deal with. How can we get away from talking about both sides in quotation marks, like there are only two sides? How can media, journalists, philanthropy, I might add activists to this question, support a broader sphere of political parties, political perspectives, than just red, blue, Dems, and GOP, et cetera? And this person goes on to say, I think we all agree that the two-party system is failing us. having that question in mind and having heard it, the final question for our panel is, what does it mean to you to radically reimagine both the definition of a healthy democracy and the path to a healthy democracy? If we're going to be radical about this reimagining, what does that mean? How do we do that? What are the elements we're going to take up in that? So, and we are interested in both healthy bodies. What does it take for all of us to be healthy in our bodies, and also for the civic body to be healthy? So radical reimagination and healthy civics. And Phil, are you looking like you're ready to go? You're muted.
Bound to happen eventually, right? The question from the audience member, I wanted to actually focus on, because I think it's such an important one. One of the huge problems with how our journalistic system operates in this country is that when it comes to covering politics, and we saw this in the wake of 2016, where our whole news media ecosystem really did all this self-evaluation, and the thing that they were most upset about themselves with was that they got the outcome wrong. And the reason I bring that up is that our news media should, their political coverage is so dictated on their end by their perceptions of who they think has a chance to win. And that is so damaging to ever allowing, yes, a more multi-party system to take hold in this country. Because the allocation of journalistic attention is so driven by assessments at any particular moment of time about who has a shot to win and who doesn't. And, that's not their job. They should not be thinking of it as their job. Their decision-making about what's newsworthy shouldn't be based on their expectations or their predictions of the outcome of an event that hasn't happened for months. So that's part of it. And the other part of it is so many ways that binaryism is built into some of the things that, we had something in this country years back called the Fairness Doctrine, right? That required broadcasters to, present opposing sides of issues of controversial issues of public importance. And there are some historical accounts that actually suggest that actually ended up sort of infiltrating print journalism as well. And so this idea of this binary both sidism just became too much a part of the norms of journalism. So these things all need to break down. And that might be the one positive. If we look back and say, what are the positives that emerge from this decimation of the traditional economic, model of journalism, it's that everybody was willing to innovate and experiment and to crumple up the old playbook of how journalism works. So that my hope would be that would be a positive that would emerge from that and lead to a much more nuanced and sophisticated approach to covering issues and covering our political landscape that could allow this two-party system to maybe break down a bit.
Thank you. We're at our last 2.5 minutes. So Josh, Adam, Courtney, about 45 seconds each. What have you got for us?
Okay. Yeah. So I think for radically reimagining the path and doing so outside of kind of a both sides or binary framing, I think we really need to think about how to center this issue of social mistrust, of alienation and disconnection from civic institutions, associations, organizations, and really put that at the center of the work that we do. So, we know that, out of time.
I'm move along. Yeah. Thank you, Josh.
Yes. Yeah.
Adam?
Yeah, I guess I'll say, to borrow an idea from Grace Lee Boggs and Adrienne Marie Brown, which is that sometimes I think we overfocus on critical mass and we miss the importance of critical connection. So I think the pandemic and the protests of the last year kind of showed us this, is that, people were critical of, like, there's a bunch of people in the streets, but where does it go from there? How are those connections yielding something that we could call systems change? So I think, to me, I can't answer that question in 45 seconds, but I think a focus on critical connection rather than critical mass, and not always just going to the capitalistic yardstick of, is this successful because it can scale, is something we need to internalize.
Thank you. Awesome. All right, Courtney, you're our last word.
Thank you. I'm going to say that we need healthy acknowledgement, and we need healing. And when we can get past that, then we can start to unify and to coordinate. But I think that civic engagement and building infrastructure starts with building relationships, and we're not doing that organically. We are still siloed, and we're joining in with groups just to push our own agendas, but we need to think about the common goals and the people that it is that we're trying to change the system for, and stay on track.
Awesome. Thank you so much. This was just a really thought-provoking, very substantive panel. I want to thank our panelists so much: Phil Napoli, Courtney Stewart, Josh Clark, and Adam Carr. We are now to take a 1-hour break and until 1:30 Eastern time. And I hope everyone has a lovely lunch and break, and we'll see you back in an hour. Thank you so much.